I got an interesting question if I interpreted it correctly, which is how do you know like if I'm using a C major scale, how do I know what the notes are if I move it somewhere else? Because the weird thing about the guitar is that we just move shapes around. Like if you think about it, like we have like a power chord, we just move these shapes around. Because on other instruments, we don't really they don't really do that. Like if you play saxophone, you're playing single notes and you're pushing keys down. You're not really moving any shapes around. On piano, like kind of moving shapes around, but it's more black and white keys. And piano players I talk to say that they really do think in terms of notes because it's just easy. It's like you can see pretty quickly, and even kids can learn pretty fast what all the notes are. Whereas the layout of the guitar is pretty crazy, so we tend to think in terms of shapes. Like let's say I had D major, and just start sliding it around. Like right there, I know what chords I'm playing from experience, and partly what I'm doing is I'm tracking a note, tracking this D. This is the root note, so the most important concept for moving shapes around is the root note, but then it's actually the shape itself. Like I know this is a major shape, and then the root note is being moved from like 3rd fret, which is D. I know this note is D. B, C, D. So if I slide it to the 6th fret, this note is F. There's D, E, F. E and F are always next to each other. So I know this is F major, but the reason why I know it is not because I'm thinking F, A, C. Like I could think that because I've played long enough to know where the notes are, but it's so slow. Like I had to think about that F, A, C, whereas if I was playing, and first of all, a lot of times guitar players we just don't care. And guitar players tend to be a little more creative than piano players, I've found, because a lot of times we just don't care on guitar. We're like that doesn't really make that much musical sense if you were trying to analyze what you were doing. I'm just sliding the shape around, and then it's like, oh, D, F, E, G, oh yeah, that sounds cool. And then that wouldn't necessarily be like in a single key, it wouldn't make that much sense. But I was just thinking, oh, I'm sliding the shape around. So same thing with the scale, like I know what these notes are, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, but actually when I'm playing this right now, I'm not thinking about anything. Whoops, I just memorized this pattern, and this is the root note of the pattern, so then if I need an A major scale, I just move it to A. So the times that I really think in terms of notes and not in terms of shapes or scale tones, which is a little more advanced. So yeah, the one other thing I would say is like when I'm sliding these shapes around, like not thinking in terms of notes. Like my brain just can't think that fast in terms of notes. Like if I played that a lot, yeah, but when I'm just making it up, it's too slow of a way of thinking for guitar. But what I do know is like what the scale tones are. So this is the root note, the 3rd, and the 5th. And that's true for all of these. So it's real easy because I know it's the same shape. So here's the 1, 3, 5. Here's the 1, 3, 5. 1, 3, 5. 1, 3, 5. And I did some music theory lessons about these concepts. But basically, scale tones come from the major scale. There's 7 notes in a major scale. So to use an example of a major scale, it doesn't matter what major scale. There's 7 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then it starts over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the scale tones, like 1, 3, 5, refers to the 1, 3, 5 of that scale. 1, 3, 5. But the thing that's a little confusing is that the root note is always shifting. So like the 1, 3, 5 is always of something. It's of a certain major scale. So right here, the 1, 3, 5 that I'm thinking about moving around is of a D. You can think about it in reference to a D note, or you can think about it in reference to a D major scale. Both would be correct ways of thinking, although like thinking about major scales all the time is kind of clunky. So really it's like it's the 1, 3, 5 of the D note. Because this note is D, this is the 1. So you have to know where the 1 is. 1, 3, 5, that makes a D major scale. And the power of that let's say I wanted to switch this E major to E minor for some reason. Well, since I know the 3 is right here of this shape, this is the 3rd, I can flat the 3rd and make it into a minor real fast. And that's a fast way of thinking, so you can do that on the spot really quick. Like, or maybe I wanted to change the G to a minor. That sounds kind of interesting. Or let's say I wanted to try to change this chord into a sus4. Since I know the 3rd is up there, I could add my pinky and add the 4. So maybe it's like... So right there I'm doing D, sus4, same concept on the next chord. But to think in terms of notes is just crazy. It would be like, this is E, G sharp, this is A, I'm changing G sharp to A. Here I'm changing G to G sharp. So I mean, you can think that way. I've just found it's too slow and it's not very helpful for like really knowing what you're doing. The only reason sometimes you really have to think in terms of notes is when you're trying to communicate with piano players and explain, like if I want to say, well, what am I doing right here? I mean, if I said, well, I'm doing D sus4, D to D sus4, F, or E flat major, I mean F major to F sus4, E to E sus4, and E flat to E sus4, they'd be kind of like, I mean, unless they really knew what they were doing, it might be a little hard for them to process that, and they don't actually know what sus chords are usually. So you might have to be like, well, I'm playing D, but then I'm adding a G into it, and then I'm going up to an E major chord, and I'm adding an A. Like I'm changing G sharp to A, and then I'm going to E flat, and I'm changing G to G sharp. And usually that's kind of a slow process, unless the person's, like, depending on what level of musicians you're playing at. So I mean, it's pretty cool when you're playing with other musicians who are at the same level as you or higher level. You can just kind of get what you're doing. So back to the major scale thing. Like if I was playing a major scale, like let's say I wanted to just solo with that, and someone was going, they were playing like basic chords in C, then I would just, and I just wanted to make up like something using a major scale, you could just be like, right there I'm not thinking about notes. All I'm thinking about is the pattern. And actually I don't ever use this major scale to solo. When I first started learning guitar, I thought that was the trick to learning how to solo, was knowing a bunch of scales. And I think for a lot of lead guitarists it is, but for the style of guitar playing I like to do, I like to more like make up riffs with like little bits of chords in them. And also I don't like to just shred up and down scales. I actually don't like that. I don't like how it sounds usually, so, and I don't really like even this sound. Like, to me it just sounds like someone's just going up and down a pentatonic scale, or same thing if it was a major scale. And it's even worse because it doesn't even, major scale just sounds kind of lame. So I mean, I practice all this stuff. It's good to practice it. But what I would do if someone's playing like, first thing I do is just kind of play along with them and play the same chords. And then I might be like, alright, kind of know what the chords are, and I might do it up higher, like a G, so. I might play the same thing up in a higher spot, but then what really is helpful is to know these little shapes, like. So I was C, G, F, C, G, so C, G, F, something like that. And then I would start to look at these shapes and start to kind of construct, like, usually it happens faster than what I'm showing because you just start to do it. The longer you play guitar, you don't care so much if you make mistakes. So I'd be like, see, it sounds pentatonic, but what I just did was, and then I'd start keep doing that for a little while and remember that riff, and maybe work some pentatonic in there, like if you want it bluesier. That wouldn't really work, it'd be too bluesy, so maybe I'd shift over to this pattern for a second, so I'd be like, oops. So then I'm kind of working this little scale in there. And then I still wouldn't think about the major scale because it just doesn't give me very cool results usually. So I work that in there, and then maybe I would start, another trick that I do is instead of just playing like the same chords, because right now I was playing the same chords they would be playing, maybe you stay on one of the chords, like try to make a solo off of an F chord. What happens if someone's playing a C chord and you're playing an F chord, you're gonna get some kind of weird tensions in there. Like sometimes it could sound bad, like that sounds pretty bad because I'm mixing a C and an F chord. So maybe what would be a better example is mixing a C and a G chord, and you would end up with more like this. It sounds kind of nice. So if you stayed on the G chord the whole time while someone's playing C, and then maybe occasionally go to C. And it's kind of hard to demonstrate this because a lot of music is just sitting there and just doing it a lot of times. And then you start to just kind of pick up little melody ideas. And usually that whole process I'm not really thinking in terms of notes. I'm just thinking about scale tones. So like, but even here, I'm just thinking more about a shape. Like I know here's the root note, here's the shape. I do know this note's D when I go to it, but it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of. Sometimes I think about notes more when I need transition notes. Like if I know if I'm in the key of C, I know what the notes are in the key of C. So if I need to make like a big leap, like. Let's say I want to jump like down to here, I would probably think about a C note. Just briefly, to kind of allow me to shift from here to here. Because these kind of like more localized ways of thinking, like with the root note and the fives and stuff, like if you need to make big jumps, like right here, I'm thinking about this shape for the whole pattern, and I'm thinking about this note as part of the pattern. Maybe this note. I'm not thinking about this note. It's too far away. But I know this is C and I know I'm on a C chord, so I could jump around different C's by knowing where different C's are. So that's a helpful thing to know. It's also, I guess, helpful like if you made up a riff like I showed. Something like that. Like, I guess sometimes it's helpful to think out what the notes are if you wanted to move it lower. like if you like right here, if I need to, like here, like what notes were these? D, E. So here I'm using my ear more. It's like. Yeah, so I'm kind of using my ear more, and then a little bit of note knowledge, and like a tiny bit of shape knowledge. Like this shape sort of changes when you get down here. But I wouldn't really think about it. I would do it more by ear, like. So you just kind of got, the main thing is just start to not care if you make a mistake, like getting comfortable going. I mean, like. Oh, there it is. Just kind of like hack around until you got it. And eventually, the more you do that, it starts to make more sense. And if you play guitar every day, and like a lot with the same chords, then you can start to really just master stuff. So for me, like if I'm actually like really practicing something, like I'll be able to see stuff in my head really clear. But like then if I take a few days off or I'm working on a totally different idea, it still takes like kind of hacking around until you get it. So I hope that sort of answered the question about like how to think about notes. I think it's important to learn notes, but it's also a little bit unrealistic to think you're going to look at the guitar and know what every note is, unless you go to like music school, like, and you're doing guitar 8 hours a day for 4 years. And I knew guys like that who really knew like everything. But the one thing I would say about that is it doesn't necessarily translate into good music. Like a lot of the best songs and bands, they actually don't know that much about music theory or anything. They just have good taste and in whatever style they're doing. So I mean, I've also known people that just like you just learn by just making songs, and I've seen that's true for myself. Like instead of worrying about anything, you just start making a song, and then all of a sudden before you know it, you just learned a ton because you kind of like run into like real problems. So anyways, hope that was helpful. It's just kind of my thoughts about how to think about notes in a scale and what sort of is actually useful. But it's always a subjective question, because if you want to be like a jazz lead guitar solo player, I mean, everything I just said could be totally untrue for your situation. Or if you just want to play power chords and do punk music, you could pretty much throw all this out the window and just learn power chords and just start playing with distortion. A lot of people do that. But for me, like after playing for a long time, this is kind of what I've settled on, is more the shapes and worrying about the root notes. So I hope that was helpful. Alright, bye.